Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from today. I'm so delighted that you could join us today. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the National Convener and one of the co-founders of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And today, we're really delighted to be able to share with you a selection of some of the most amazing activists, lawyers, and people who know about rights of nature. If you've seen the program, it's kind of amazing. We've got people from all around the world, and we've ordered them depending on the ease of their time zones. So before I actually kick off, what I would like to do is acknowledge country. There's a tradition in Australia as a colonial country to actually acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of Aboriginal peoples across this continent. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the amazing lands of the Kabi Kabi and Jinnabara peoples. I have a couple of maps that I'll show you in a moment, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I am on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. And the work we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is all about trying to find ways to shift our current systems in industrialised societies from human-centred ways of governing ourselves towards an earth-centred way of thinking, feeling, acting, and organising ourselves. What I would like to do first this morning is we'll be playing a pre-recorded talk by Margil from CDER, the Community Centre for Democratic and Environmental Rights. So I'm going to play that in a moment. And I see a few faces on video. If you can put your thumbs up that you can hear that recording as soon as I start playing it, then that's terrific. That would be great. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today will be an amazing overview of rights of nature developments around the world. We're starting with Margil, who couldn't be with us live because she has other travel commitments, but she's one of the earliest pioneers of the rights of nature movement. So her talk is really quite a fantastic summary of how things began with their work and the kinds of things she's been seeing across the world. Of course, as a pre-recording, there's no time for Q&A with Mari. I asked her a couple of questions myself. And once the recording is finished, we'll go straight to the wonderful Margaret Stewart, who's already with us. And she's from the Centre for Earth Jurisprudence in the US, and I'll let her introduce herself properly. But if all goes well and the buttons work, I'll now turn to the pre-recording with Margil from the US.
I want to thank AELA and particularly Michelle Maloney for hosting us and inviting us to participate in this event. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the rights of nature is, sort of set the table so that we all have a similar idea and understanding of what it is, why it's advancing in places around the world, and how that's happened and emerged over the past 15 plus years now. So first, just in a very basic idea, the rights of nature is the recognition of legal rights of nature. And nature includes ecosystems and species, as well as all of nature within a particular jurisdiction. And so laws and court decisions have been issued which recognize that nature, or an ecosystem or a species, possess legal rights. So a very basic idea. And those legal rights include rights like the most basic right of all, the right of nature to exist. But beyond that, rights to flourish or thrive, rights to regenerate, the right of nature to naturally evolve, the right of nature to be restored if its rights are violated or if it's harmed. And beyond that, those sort of basic set of rights were what characterized the earliest rights of nature laws, and still are in many, many rights of nature laws that have gone forward. But beyond that, rights have also now been recognized that are more specific to a particular aspect or part of nature. So for instance, the right of wild rice species to freshwater habitat, or the right of a river or other waterway to flow. So these broad set of rights that are necessary for nature to be healthy and robust and resilient, but also species or ecosystem specific rights to ensure that the needs of that ecosystem or species are being met. So that's what the rights of nature is. And we now have rights of nature laws that have been adopted in local communities and by nations, by states, and by courts as well, have ruled that certain ecosystems, for instance, possess legal rights within the jurisdiction. And so beginning in 2006 was the very first rights of nature law. My colleague, Thomas Lindsay, here at the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, wrote that first law, the first anywhere in the world, and that recognized for the very first time that nature possesses legal rights. It was a rights of nature law. And it was adopted in a small community within the state of Pennsylvania in the eastern United States. The community was facing the dumping of toxic waste, and they determined that existing environmental and public health laws weren't able to protect them from this toxic waste coming into their community. And so they had to essentially take themselves out from under the conventional existing legal system to determine why that was, how that was, and what they could do about it. So that's what I wanted to talk about now, because the question is, why are rights of nature laws advancing around the globe? We have about 30 plus communities across the United States that have local laws in place. We have local laws in Brazil. We have local laws in Canada. We have state level laws in Mexico. We have national rights of nature laws in place in Ecuador, in the Constitution, in Bolivia, in Panama, in Uganda, in Spain. And we have courts that in places like Colombia and India and Bangladesh that have recognized that rivers and other ecosystems possess certain legal rights. So this is a growing movement really around the world, and it's moving this idea of nature being a, can it possess legal rights? Does nature even have a basic right to even exist? And moving that questioning, that theory that nature could be a rights holder, and putting it into practice, i.e. putting it into binding enforceable legal rights into law. And that's sort of the journey that we've been taking over the past 15 plus years, is moving nature from being considered this a thing, as an item of commerce or property that exists for human use. It's just sitting there waiting for us to use it. That's how environmental laws treat nature today, as just this thing without legal rights. And it's why environmental laws, not only in my home country of the United States, but also environmental laws around the world, treat nature in this way, as without legal rights, as just this thing. And our environmental laws regulate, legalize, authorize how we use that thing, i.e. how do we use nature? It's why environmental laws legalize things like oil and gas drilling, or legalize things like gold mining or fracking, all activities that we know bring significant major environmental harm. Fracking, for instance, it contaminates millions of gallons of fresh water at every frack well, and yet fracking is taking place all over the world today, even as we're facing major water crises all over the world. But other activities too. It's why industries are legally authorized to pollute greenhouse gas trapping emissions, which is accelerating, causing climate change. It's why we have places like in the United States, the Colorado ecosystem, which is an ecosystem that is very much on the brink, that every drop of water, it's been identified and delegated to somebody to use. It's these sorts of things. We treat nature as existing without limits. But I think, just look at any newspaper or headline today, and we're going to see that the limits of nature are very, very much being met and exceeded. These environmental laws that treat nature as existing for human use, and which we just simply regulate how we're going to use it and how quickly we can use it, and how much we can pollute, and how much we can exploit, how much we can extract. It's no wonder that we now find ourselves on the brink of ecosystem collapse and the acceleration of species extinction all over the world, and of course, climate change. The impacts of that getting more ferocious every day, every month, every year, because we're treating nature as something other. The rights of nature emerged from that morass of environmental law in which we treat nature this way, with people beginning to say, wait a minute, that's not actually protecting nature. I'm laughing because it's so crazy that to even say it out loud 15 years ago that environmental laws were not set up to protect the environment, you'd get laughed out of the room. But that's really the situation. Environmental laws largely are about how do we exploit nature and how quickly can we exploit nature. And people that we began to work with, particularly in local communities facing threats such as toxic waste being dumped in their community, they would look to environmental laws to protect them from those activities, only to find that those environmental laws that they looked to help them were actually authorizing the very harms they were trying to stop. And that's a real eye-opener if you've ever faced that, some sort of threat coming into your community that you want to stop, only to realize that your state government, your provincial governor, or your national government has actually legalized that harm and legalized it to take place in your community, where it can affect your family, your children, your water quality, your air quality, soils, lands, and so on. And people began to reject that system of environmental law. And that's from whence the rights of nature moved from theory into practice, with people saying, so long as we treat nature as property or an item of commerce, we cannot protect it. We need to move it into a place where it has, first and foremost, even the most basic right of all, which is the right to exist. We need to move nature from being considered a thing without legal rights to being recognized as a legal entity with legal rights, including even that most basic right of all, which is the right to exist, to be. And so that transformation occurred in 2006 for the very first time with the rights of nature law. And that has really transformed what environmental law can look like. So in 2006, we have the first law. In 2008, we were invited to consult with Ecuador's Constituent Assembly that was drafting a new constitution. And as part of our efforts there, Ecuador's delegates took the rights of nature and built it into their new national constitutional framework. And Ecuador in 2008 became the first country in the world to enshrine constitutional rights of nature, or what they call Pachamama. The first country to do so, still the first country to have it within a constitutional framework. And from there, the movement has grown. So we have national laws, as I mentioned, in other places. We have local laws, state level laws, courts following this lead. And it's been really happened so quickly, at least to our eyes, this really fundamental shift in how we not only govern ourselves, we being humankind, govern ourselves toward the natural world, but how we treat nature itself as a living being with recognized legal rights that can be implemented and can be enforced and can be defended. And so we find ourselves in a place today where more places are looking to move the rights of nature into some form of law or policy, or courts taking a hold of it and saying, we need this here. And so, for instance, there was a fairly recently a law put into place at the national level in Panama to protect sea turtles. And so sea turtles have specific legal rights, including things like a right to habitat and not be interfered with. You have court cases that have come out of Ecuador's constitutional court, their highest court, in which you have, for instance, mining within a cloud forest. The constitutional court found that that violated the rights of that ecosystem, that forest ecosystem, as well as the endangered species who live there. So it was a violation of their rights, including their right to habitat, because without their right to habitat, they can't meet their right to exist. And so you have these really significant cases and laws that are advancing, really in places all over the world. And we are working in a bunch of different places in which people want to take it forward themselves. We think it represents a really fundamental shift in humankind's relationship with the natural world. We think there's a reason that Pope Francis has talked about that that nature does in fact have a right to exist. That you have at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth that we helped to develop is being discussed and dialogued, and that you have it moving into different kinds of policy instruments in different parts of the world. This is really a recognition, we believe, that things all over the world, very unfortunately and sadly, are getting worse. Despite the thousands of environmental laws that are in place all over the world, things are getting worse for the environment because we don't treat it as something that we ourselves are part of, that human beings are part of nature. And we don't treat it with an understanding that harm done to nature is harm done to ourselves. But more people, more communities, more governments, and even courts are now moving in the direction of that understanding and putting that understanding into law so that we human beings, can do things like stand in the shoes of a river to defend the rights of the river. And First Nations, tribal nations, Indigenous peoples are very much at the forefront of this movement. So we've worked within the states with a number of tribal nations that have moved rights of nature policies and laws into their own tribal governance frameworks. And one I wanted to mention is early this year, so in the springtime in the Northern Hemisphere of 2023, a case that we assisted with the Soxhawtla tribe, which is in Washington State, which is the northwest corner of the continental United States. They brought a case into their own tribal court to have the rights of salmon recognized. Their traditional lands include the Skagit River ecosystem, and the city of Seattle had put in place a number of dams on the river. And those dams prevented salmon from swimming upstream to their traditional spawning grounds. And that was having deep, deep impacts on the health and well-being of the salmon, which several of which are listed under our Endangered Species Act here in the United States. The Soxhawtla consider salmon to be a relative and saw that their rights were being violated by these dams, preventing salmon from actually living the lives that they need to live to be a healthy, robust species. And so they brought a case into tribal court against the city of Seattle. And earlier this year, a settlement was reached between tribes, including the Soxhawtla and the city. And for the very first time, the city agreed to create fish passage to help the salmon move upstream to get to their historical spawning grounds. And that's a huge decision by the city to agree to do something like that. And that's the first rights of nature legal settlement that we've had here in the States. So we think it's a really important milestone, obviously for the salmon and for the people of Soxhawtla and other tribes in that area that have long depended on salmon as a staple food and who consider the salmon a relative, but also just in marking a real shift in what we're seeing in terms of human relation to the natural world. And Indigenous communities and tribes and First Nations are really moving this work forward themselves and sharing their own cultural relationship with the natural world that is really quite different from traditional Western cultures. And I think that's a really important and positive development, particularly over the last several years, because this work is, as much as it is about legal change and changing how nature itself is treated under the law to becoming rights-bearing, it also requires a massive cultural shift and gaining an understanding and appreciation for the relationship that Indigenous peoples all over the world have with the natural world, which is so different from Western cultures, I think is really critical to the success and the advancement of this movement as well. So those legal shifts and those cultural shifts, I think, are kind of moving forward together more and more, which to me suggests that a very robust movement is building. And so I think I'll stop there and see if we can have a little conversation.
Thank you so much, Mari. That was a wonderful overview, very succinct, actually, given you've been involved in this area of work for almost 2 decades, which is pretty exciting, actually. So, and thank you very much for sharing that example about the salmon. I didn't know about that case. That really is incredibly exciting that the officials of the city of Seattle had to actually engage with the discourse and the discussion about the rights of salmon. I find that really encouraging. So it's really terrific to hear your overview of how the rights of nature issues and approaches and legal structures started to emerge. Two questions for you. The first is about the very early days of the work that you and Thomas were doing in the US. I just wonder if you can reflect on some of the cultural changes you may have seen. Is it getting any easier compared to, say, 15 years ago when you would talk to people about the rights of nature? How do you find folks today? Have they, I would imagine, more likely they've heard of this issue, they know a bit more about it. I'm sure there's a lot of pushback, but how have things changed or not changed in your time working on this?
Well, I think human nature is a funny thing. And I think I've learned a lot about it doing this work. And I'll say, I guess, two responses, Michelle, and both of them I think are, for better or worse, positive. Number one, it's so difficult. Any major kind of societal shift like this, and in this case, we're talking about changing how nature is considered, how it's treated under the law, and transforming what that looks like. Where for so long, Western societies have treated nature as just something expendable, unlimited, and so on, and the consequences of that are devastating. And so the kind of shift that is happening, I think, is really, really amazing. But it's so difficult to be the first to go forward with that shift. And so what I mean is, like, the first to pass a law. For instance, Ecuador, the first to put it into a national framework, and for them it was their constitution. And once those first cases go forward, those first laws, it's amazing what happens. Because I can just remember, I remember so clearly, once Ecuador's constitution was ratified and the vote was announced, and they became the first country to put the rights of nature into their constitution, our phone literally started ringing off the hook saying, we didn't know this was possible. Now we know it's possible. How do we do that here? Calls from India, Nepal, and other places. And so it's sort of like, I say human nature because I think that we're all, like, no one wants to be the first person to volunteer, like, for the softball game or something like that. So silly to say something, but it's true. I see it, like, in these really small parts of our lives, but then in these really big parts of our lives. But so it's easier now to talk about this, to get back to your question. It's easier now to talk about it because other places have done it now. And so people can look to that and go, oh, they did it. That makes it real, makes it tangible. And it provides, I hate to say, legitimacy to it, but it does. And people can kind of get their minds around it better when we can talk about cases, particularly like in Ecuador, which has had it in place for the longest now. They've had real outcomes from these cases, stopping mining, in a fragile ecosystem, stopping industrial shrimp farming from occurring in mangrove forest on their coast. Really tangible things have happened because of the rights of nature. And that, I think, makes it very real, helps people to get their minds around it. So that part has really gotten easier. I'm not going to say easy, but easier. The other thing, which is sort of the awful thing, which is that things are getting worse with the environment. There's just no escaping it. Climate change, the loss of species, although there were coral reefs bleaching and dying out. I think the impacts of climate change are becoming so real to so many. I mean, like, in the United States, I can just tell you, I just saw a headline and kind of didn't have the heart to read the whole story. I hate to say it, but that 50% of Americans experience some kind of climate change impact this summer, because we've had, heat domes, and we've had forest fires. We've had a whole community in Hawaii just get destroyed by forest fires just several weeks ago. And we've had these massive hurricanes that are causing all sorts of impacts. So it's the environmental devastation that we human beings have wrought upon the earth, I think, is becoming more real for people. And as a result of that, again, silver lining on a very dark cloud, people are saying we need to do something different. We cannot continue as status quo isn't working. What can we do that's different? And what represents a really fundamental shift? And the rights of nature has been the answer to that question for many, many, many people, and including governments. So that's, I think, we don't want those devastating things to happen, but you do want people to begin to think differently. And this, unfortunately, I think, is pushing people in that direction. So it is easier to talk about for both good reasons and bad reasons. but I think it makes the conversation, it facilitates the conversation. And I think people are getting to a place where they're realizing something really major needs to shift.
Yeah, I would agree. And what we've been observing around the world, both in that rapid movement of the rights of nature developments after the firsts, but also as more and more people are becoming aware of the environmental problems. We've noticed in our own work in AELA, people really more interested in the systems change kind of ideas and the work. Thank you. So a final question for you is, have there been any surprises in where these rights of nature laws have either emerged, or the kinds of issues or topics or species that they've been brought in to focus on and protect? Have there been any surprises, things you didn't see coming in the movement?
Well, I think the surprise actually occurred very early on. One of the biggest surprises to me, I live in the United States. I'm sure as people kind of are aware, things are pretty politically polarized here. But the rights of nature laws, the first laws, which have been very, local level laws, and continue to advance there, have come out of not what we would consider in the United States to be very progressive or liberal communities. They've really come out of more conservative, politically speaking, communities, because they've been on, many conservative communities are rural in the States, and they have often been on the receiving end of really horrible, environmentally harmful projects like dumping of toxic waste or industrial hog farms or other things. And they have been the first to come together to say we need a really major shift. Other place, and so that is a trend that we saw from the very beginning. I will say that one of the places that also surprised me in terms of how large the support was for the rights of nature was in Orange County, Florida. In 2020, voted on a rights of nature laws that we helped to develop, and it was about rights of rivers and waterways there. Florida is a pretty, is growing more and more conservative over time. And it's a community that voted over, I think it was 89% of the vote in favor of the rights of nature. And, a huge majority, which we just generally don't see when it's put to a vote. It's usually a closer vote than that. But again, it's because things have gotten so bad in the state of Florida, from blue-green algae blooms, from water quality, from industrial agriculture, like we'll call like big sugar and other agriculture that just contaminated waterways across the state, the degradation of the Everglades, which are trying to be restored, the Gulf Coast. Florida sits on the Gulf of Mexico, and we've seen just fish die-offs there. We've seen off the coast of Florida this year water temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I'm not good at this, 32 degrees Celsius. I'm not very good at that, but a very unnatural temperature. And so all to say that people can see things with their own eyes, and I think it puts politics to the side when you realize that this is coming home to where you live, affecting you and your family and your neighbors and so on. So I think that to me actually has been one of the biggest surprises in this work from the beginning, but also one of the most heartening ones, I guess is a way to say it, because it can cross politics, and not just in the States, other places too. But again, as things get worse with the environment, I think that's happening more and more. So it's, you don't want things to get worse, but it has a tendency, crises, emergencies have a tendency to bring people together no matter their political affiliation. And we need that right now.
Yes, we absolutely do. And thank you so much, Mari. It's been really a delight to have this succinct summary of where things have come from and where they're going. Although you can't join us live, I want to thank you so much for having a pre-recorded discussion with us. And I'm sure many people will be interested to know where all of these ideas started to roll out into the legal system. So thank you very much for your time, Mari, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Michelle.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. That was a recording, and I've had a lovely question from Rachel about how do we make these local local laws and local discussions happen. Rachel, with your permission, I might actually come back to that when I'm talking with Margaret, because in the live conversation, we'll be able to talk about that together. I think that overview from Mari sets the scene for the day. A lot of these rights of nature laws have been emerging only in the last 5 or 6 years, but a lot of the early work on some of this challenging of Western laws, treatment of nature as property, has been going on for some time.